Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. The Vice President of the United States is in China in conversation with the new boss, the new leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party controls the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force. This is very much a conversation, we're told, and I'm looking at the front of the New York Times website right now, circling around a confrontation over the East China Sea, the uninhabited Senkaku Islands. We're told in the first paragraph, within these hours, that China is pushing back against the United States, against Vice President Joseph Biden's recommendation that China rescind Air Defense Identification Zone. This is a story that's been developing since November 23rd when China, the PRC, unilaterally declared an Air Defense Identification Zone over the Senkakus and over the East China Sea, cross-claiming with Japan as well as South Korea. That's at the center of the conversation tonight. My friend Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me. I flag at the beginning, however, and Gordon will develop this very carefully through the evening, and we'll have conversation with many sophisticated voices, that there is a rumor right now of great turmoil in the new leadership of the Chinese Communist Party involving Xi Jinping himself and another man who's been removed from power, was a member of the Standing Committee in the previous regime, and is now said to be detained. Gordon, characterize the rumor right now, what we know about these blows between Chinese leaders.
Within the last few minutes, Minjing News from Hong Kong reports that Zhou Yongkong, the former member of the Politburo Standing Committee, the guy who was in charge of internal security, has been detained. There have been stories about him under investigation for corruption, but this story is that he's been detained for an attempt to assassinate Xi Jinping. Last March, there were rumors of gunfire at Zhongnan High, which is the leadership compound in Beijing. And as well, Zhou Yongkong is known to be a good friend, or at least an acquaintance, of Johnson Tak, who is the number 2 in North Korea, who has just been purged.
We're looking at rumors in China, but remember, this being 1 billion people and having complete instantaneous communication these days, we're looking at a rumor that will ripen over these next hours and over these next days. The vice president is in China. Xi Jinping has pushed back against the United States recommendation, State Department, to rescind the unilateral declaration of the Air Defense Identification Zone. We're joined now by someone who can help us understand the significance, geostrategic significance of this contest over uninhabited islands and over a part of an ocean that forms what you'd have to say, a narrative through East Asia these last thousands of years. Toshi Yoshihara is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, as well as the author with his colleague James Holmes of Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy. Professor, a very good evening to you. The first island chain, that's Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. At the center of that, if I read my map correctly, is the East China Sea. This claim or cross-claim unilateral by the PLA Navy, does it strengthen China's strategic position, military position in the region? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Absolutely. I think it's important to note that from the Chinese perspective, if you're looking from Beijing, casting its glance out into the Western Pacific, what they see is this string of islands, this first island chain that stretches from Japan down through the Philippines. They see this as a major geostrategic barrier to their larger maritime ambitions, which is to break out onto the high seas. And so in order for them to do that, they need to begin to establish the conditions by which they can break through the first island chain into the larger Pacific. And so in addition to their very rapid military modernization, they are now making these types of claims, including the ADIZ, as a way, essentially, to carve out that space inside of the first island chain that would strengthen their position for them to break out into the future.
Toshi, I've seen reports that Chinese strategists have been elated by the formation of the Air Defense Identification Zone because they say that this gives control to Beijing's Navy to, as you say, break through the first island chain. So really, this is more than just the Senkakus. This is more than just hydrocarbons. We're talking about a gateway to the Western Pacific.
That's right. In my view, I think the struggle over the Senkakus and the zones, both the exclusive economic zone and the air defense identification zone, are really manifestation of a larger strategic struggle. And it's really the struggle for mastery over the near sea, what the Chinese call the near seas, which includes the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea. And so, again, this is really a larger geopolitical tussle between China and Japan, but I think the much bigger picture is a larger struggle between China and the United States over who gets to have the right and the ability to impose their prerogatives in those bodies of water.
Yeah, we often talk about China versus Japan, and we focus in on the centuries of antagonism. But I was talking to a South Korean diplomat today, and he raised the possibility that China will declare a new air defense identification zone, not just over the South China Sea, but also the Yellow Sea, which would really be something that people have not been talking about. And it's important to note that when the South Koreans asked the Chinese this last week to redraw their zone to get it out of South Korea's sovereign territorial airspace, the Chinese refused. So this is not just China versus Japan. This is China versus a number of other countries, and this has less to do with historical antagonism and much more to do with China's ambitions to be able to dominate the Western Pacific.
Right. I think that that may be, in fact, China's next step. We have heard from the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines that they essentially reserve the right to establish an air identification zone over the South China Sea. And I think what is very important to note here is that although they make the claim that those zones support the freedom of overflight rights, she adds a very important qualifier, which is as long as they follow Chinese rules and regulations, which is, of course, a contradiction in terms. Overflight freedoms, simply what they are. States have an inherent right to have overflight rights over those zones. And to say that other states need permission from China is a real problematic statement.
The Chinese Communist Party is a government of men, not a government of law. Therefore, Professor, I'd ask you to interpret these facts. In April of this year, Xi Jinping, the new boss, he's a year in power, fifth generation, visited the carrier base of the first and only Chinese aircraft carrier. And then again in September, he visited the submarine and destroyer bases. These are separate parts of the Chinese naval power. Is Xi Jinping identifying himself with the PLA Navy? Would it be understood that way in China?
Well, Xi Jinping has some very grand ambitions that's been encapsulated by the so-called China Dream, which is for China to reach a full level of what they call rejuvenation, which is a point by which China becomes a legitimate great power. And alongside with that great power, I think in Xi's view, is that China needs to have great sea power as well. And I think he is personally very interested in developing maritime power, having made many important statements and speeches about making China into a maritime power. So it's not surprising that he has staked his personal political capital in the development of Chinese sea power, including the Chinese Navy, by making these very highly visible symbolic visits.
And quickly, Professor, is it coincidence or convenient that the only aircraft carrier sortied through the East China Sea to the South China Sea, and I believe you tell me it's now at Hainan, that is simultaneous with this claim? Do you believe we should read that as coordinated?
Well, it's hard to say whether it's coordinated, but it sends a very powerful message because all of the neighboring states in Southeast Asia simply cannot withstand that kind of a sea power. The carrier is really a powerful tool against those much weaker Southeast Asian states.
And Toshi, I take it that the Chinese are starting their second carrier, their first home-built one in Shanghai. What do you say? What do you account for these rumors? True or not true, or how do you look at them?
Well, I've been hearing and reading from Chinese writings that China will not stop simply with one carrier. This is basically their stepping stone to a next set of carriers. So it's no surprise to me that they're already working on their next generation of carriers that will be much more capable based on all of the lessons that they will be learning from this first Liaoning carrier.
Professor Toshi Yoshihara, the author of Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy, a book prescient of the moment. I remind you, Vice President Biden is rebuked by the President of China over the request to stop this confrontation in the East China Sea. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.